On this week's Carrier App, we speak with Dan Hayes from PwC's Strategy and Division about the FCC's 600 megahertz incentive auction, including what we can expect to hear about the proceedings over the next several weeks and possible long-term concerns connected with the process. Well, thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. And this week we are joined again by Dan Hayes, who's the principal at PwC's Strategy and Division. Hey, Dan, thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
Great. Thanks so much. And again, I know we talked a couple of months back, but I think it'd be a good time to get maybe an update as we are now officially into the FCC's 600 megahertz auction, starting off this week, kicking off with the reverse auction process, which is where television broadcasters offer up, I guess, to the extent their spectrum to be then used in the forward auction process down the road here. But I guess as we're looking at kind of what's happened over the past couple of months, I guess what's been your overall view of how the FCC has, I guess, managed to kind of put this thing, which has been, again, extremely complicated, to kind of actually get this thing, I guess, rolling to this point?
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, this auction has been like the train just steaming down the tracks. It's actually pretty impressive that to date they've maintained all the milestones, all of the process that was laid out and where we thought things were going to be going. So I think in that respect, everything's been good. Over the last couple of months, we've gone through some pretty important milestones. You had all the broadcasters back on January 12th who filed their applications. We don't know yet how many that was or who it was, but it seems to have gone pretty smoothly. And since then, the FCC has issued a couple of rounds of communications back to those same broadcasters, confirming whether their applications were complete, and then, confirming whether they had been approved for participation in the auction, issuing them, secure tokens so that they could log into the auction site. All those things seem to have gone remarkably on track. And this week really has been the first big milestone, in my opinion, where you have now the broadcaster saying, "Yep, it's put up or shut up," and we're gonna actually be there for the first round of bidding. So, now we have behind us all the broadcaster commitments, their initial commitments for whether they're gonna accept an option in the first round of the reverse auction, and whether they are going to what option they're going to choose, whether they do a full relinquishment, move down the band from UHF to VHF, or whether they elect to go down a channel sharing path, perhaps. So, now we've got a lot of waiting to do.
Yeah.
It's going to be, a few weeks now. We're expecting probably a good 6 weeks or so, perhaps, before the bidding rounds get started in earnest. So we're in a little bit of hurry up and wait mode.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it is. I guess for myself, again, I enjoy these spectrum auctions like nobody else. I mean, I've loved these things over the years. I follow them on an hourly by hourly basis. But again, this is a different kind of process where it's a quiet kind of period right now. We're not really sure what's happening behind the scenes, at least from the broadcaster's point of view. Like you said, we don't really know who's involved. I don't think we have an idea who's involved. Yeah. And I think the NAB came out and said that there was robust participation in this. So we can assume that there is, pretty good commitments from broadcasters at this point as well too. But again, we still don't quite know where we're at. But again, I guess, like you said, we are kind of in a wait and a sit and wait period or hurry up and wait period for this. But I guess, from your point of view, are you expecting pretty good then support from broadcasters in terms of their participation, you think, in this process?
Yeah, all signals have been really good from the broadcast community, at least for participation, going into the early rounds of the auction. Now, how quickly people drop out or what happens is hard to say. Yeah. In the coming weeks, we got a few interesting sort of interim milestones to take place. So, coming up, we've got the FCC will hold some mock auctions. So that'll be the first time that most of the bidders get a chance to really interact with the auction system that the FCC's put in place. And we understand they've built a pretty new type of system to accommodate this reverse auction. So far, it doesn't seem like it's going to be too complicated, but these are big numbers, and so got to make sure everything goes smoothly. The other thing, which is perhaps even more important right now, is based on all of the commitments that were made this week, the commission has to now go through the process of establishing what its spectrum clearing target is going to be. And that's what all of us here in the wireless industry really are focused on, right? Are we going to be able to clear that, 126 megahertz of spectrum? Is it going to be a much lower number based on the broadcaster participation? There's a lot of calculus going on right now, and a lot of CPU cycles being absorbed, I'm sure, by some FCC computers trying to figure out, what that channel clearing target should be. And that's going to be the really big decision. And once that's announced, the rest of the auction should proceed on a pretty kind of linear, pre-programmed basis, hopefully.
Yeah. Again, I'm guessing that most we get to the forward auction process, I think for the most part that'll be pretty standard. Again, there's the set aside thing that's gonna maybe kind of be a little different for a lot of operators. But yeah, for the most part, it sounds like a forward auction. But again, for the reverse part here, and I know one of the concerns it seems like from broadcasters has kind of been a bit of the channel sharing issues, or whether how they were going to get moved around and repackaged. I guess as we've led into this, do you think that part has been handled to the satisfaction of most broadcasters, or is this going to be an issue that might crop up later on, or I guess how has that part been dealt with so far?
Yeah, so sort of separating the two issues, the channel sharing issue, I think, has actually gone probably about as well as it could have. It was a new situation for a lot of broadcasters, something they hadn't encountered before. Although from a technical perspective, channel sharing is something that the broadcast community already does in the digital world. So that piece of it isn't terribly difficult for them. It's really the commercial back and forth of negotiating deals. And we did hear about coming up to the application deadline when people had to elect channel sharing options or not. We did hear about a lot of last minute deal negotiations going on, some deals falling apart. All the things that you expect to happen when you have that kind of firm deadline. But in general, the channel sharing piece doesn't seem to have too many people worried. Okay. Now, the repacking, as you said, is a whole nother issue. Okay. And the repacking, right, for all of us in the wireless world, it's essentially what happens to the TV stations left behind after the auction closes, right? We're going to have a lot of stations that are going to have to get moved down from the top end of the band to lower in the band. A lot of people have talked about, the stations being compressed down from where they are today, up to channel 51, maybe not making it, they'll probably wind up somewhere in the 20s as the highest TV channel. That motion is going to be a particularly complicated set of changes to take place. And some of the things we hear people worrying about are availability of equipment for upgrades, and even critically, availability of tower crews who can go out and work on, the transmitters and antennas and things, especially on some of these extremely tall, extremely loaded TV towers. Yeah. And so there has been some concern, and this was one of the issues raised ahead of the auction by the National Association of Broadcasters about, will they have enough time to really get all of that in place? That's still to be determined. Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, I guess I shouldn't confuse the channel sharing aspect with the repackaging, because the channel sharing, I know the FCC has kind of been working in that for the past several years, really, working with broadcasters to get them involved in that. So yeah, you're right. That seemed like that progressed pretty well. But yeah, it's the repackaging part that obviously for the wireless side is going to be the biggest challenge. But like you said too, there was some back and forth prior to the start here about the issues, like you said, like whether there be enough people around to handle. The equipment has to be put up for this. Again, the big towers have to be worked on. I know there's some court issues that came up as well. So it did seem like there were some last minute issues. Does it seem like for the most part that those you think have been solved to the right extent? And again, I guess this kind of leads to the whole question of the timing aspect too, because there is that aspect of the 39-month window there as well. Is that enough time for this to kind of all happen? What's been your view? What have you heard out there about people's concern about that part?
I think there are generally concerns, and quite frankly, it's probably followed the student principle of people haven't really been paying much attention to it. They figure they can get the homework done once it's closer to the date that it's due. And I think we've seen a lot of that here in the broadcast industry, right? Without knowing how many stations are going to be cleared, which stations it would be in which markets. Quite frankly, there hasn't been a lot that people can do or can worry about. So we haven't seen a ton of focus in that respect. I think one of the things that the broadcasters are starting to wake up to is the notion that unlike the DTV transition, the digital television transition that we went through years back, where there was a large-scale national education campaign for the public, the viewing public for television about what was going to happen, there's really no coordinated effort planned as of yet for this change. So, for those of us that watch, over-the-air TV, we may have to go through, hopefully it won't be too complicated, but we may have to go through the process maybe even several times of rescanning the channels that we receive so that our TV now locks them in correctly. The digital technology allows them to, identify themselves even using their old identifier, but they're going to be broadcasting in many cases if they're channel sharing or if they are repacked on new frequencies, new channels. So there is going to be some public education required. We think that that's going to be something that probably once all the dust settles from the auction, people will really start to look at it and figure out how to address.
Yeah. I mean, I guess is there a bad assumption then that we just, everybody just kind of thinks that since the 700 megahertz DTV transition went, I guess, somewhat smoothly, that this will just be as easy as of a process? And is that kind of maybe a false assumption we might be making?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an assumption in many ways that this one will go more smoothly.
Okay.
And the reason for that is, right, from a consumer perspective, the DTV transition was a little traumatic because you had to have a digital compatible set or you had to get an adapter box.
Yeah.
Here, the consumer really doesn't have to do anything other than rescan the channels. So pretty simple in that respect, but I don't know about you, but I don't remember how to do that on my TVs. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who will be perplexed.
Yeah. No, I've got younger nieces and nephews who can figure that stuff out beyond me. So yeah, I've given up on that stuff. I'm too old for that. So, but I guess another thing to look at too in terms of the broadcast community is again, there's all this money numbers being thrown around about how much money these guys can actually make from this process. There's been private equity firms that have kind of gotten involved in TV stations in the past year. Again, there's a lot of, again, we're not really sure what the money's going to be. And there's, people are throwing around, the tens of billions of dollars that could be generated from this. I guess, what's been your view? What have you been hearing about in terms of the financial impact this might have for operators who are, even the ones who are staying in business? Again, there might be some who are selling off some of their stations, but are still staying in business, who are going to potentially see a pretty good sized windfall. What are you hearing about what they might be doing with this, newfound extra wealth, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's unlikely that this auction will, surpass the $40+ billion that was raised in the AWS-3 auction last year. It just doesn't seem like it's likely, but you never know. Now, regardless of that, it seems like a fair bet that this auction will raise 20, 30, maybe even a little north of that, $1 billion. And that could be a significant impact, to the broadcasters in particular, right? Wireless industry is used to dropping a lot of money on a periodic basis for spectrum. It's kind of become, it's kind of like air and water. You got to have spectrum to survive. Yeah. But for the broadcasters, this is, as many have called it, really a once-in-a-lifetime type of event. And, when you think about some of the larger broadcast groups in particular, you could be talking about, depending upon what they do in the auction, you could be talking about impacts that could be, $1 billion, $2 billion, maybe more for some of the larger groups. Been a lot of estimates floating out there recently on this. And I think when you look at those types of numbers, that's a big cash infusion for the broadcast industry. They really have not had that kind of money coming into the industry in quite some time. In fact, traditional print media and broadcast media has, for the most part, been a declining industry.
Yeah.
So, if you now look at maybe, 20, 30, $35 billion being in the hands of the broadcasters, that could go to a lot of new uses. We're expecting to see, new investments, whether it's in, digital and online media, whether it's in, social media. Because I think for a lot of the broadcasters, many of them are in the media industry at their hearts. Some of them own radio stations as well, or newspapers, magazines, whatever it may be. And we don't expect to see a lot of them, although I'm sure there'll be some. That, we don't see a lot of them that will diverge from their media roots. They may want to look for new investments in this space. So that could be a great opportunity for folks in the media industry, with either startups or smaller businesses, or we may see some M&A, some consolidation among the broadcasters that are left. it's likely to really spark some new activity in the space, which could be pretty exciting for them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, a big investment or infusion of money all at one time can be a very shocking thing to the system. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see, like you said, how they react to this. Because again, some of the bigger companies, perhaps aren't, as in awe of the big numbers, but maybe some of these smaller entities that are out there, that could be a big, a big change for them.
I mean, we've met with a lot of broadcasters on this topic, and what I would tell you is that some of them are looking very actively at what investments they could be making. If you're a small TV broadcaster from a station, in rural Pennsylvania or Maine or somewhere like that, these are markets that actually have pretty high valuations on them because they are in busy, congested corridors of the United States. Same thing with some of the California markets. When you think about that, you think, gee, these guys could be yielding even a couple $100 million, $300 million, something like that for their stations, perhaps. That's a big injection into a business where, a few years ago, it might have only been worth, tens of millions of dollars. So that can be a life-changing moment for some of these businesses. So we really do think that you're going to see some interesting activity taking place.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Well, I know one thing we did see that came out over the past week was we kind of got the list of the actual participants, or at least those wireless or whatever companies who want to bid in the forward auction process. Again, a lot of the names are the ones that we expected before. I guess as you looked at the list, and perhaps not getting into any details, were there any surprises to you about what we saw naming-wise? Was there, anything that kind of stuck out to you as maybe an interesting, hey, that's kind of an interesting name there?
Yeah, the way that the application process works, and you have so many of these kind of shell companies that are set up that other than the ones that were pretty open and identified themselves, it's tough to trace back a lot of them. You get a lot of seemingly meaningless names in there. I'll give you a couple of observations, though. First of all, we shouldn't write off the fact that there is going to be some potentially significant participation by some of the rural wireless players. It's not just sort of the big four national carriers that are active in the auction. We see other smaller regional and local wireless network operators that have applied to be in the auction. And this could be a really important step for them, particularly because this spectrum, unlike some of the auctions in years past, is pretty likely to get put into use fairly quickly, and will help enable them to get access to devices and equipment, which is often one of the big struggles for the rural guys. So that was one interesting thing from there. Not a huge surprise, but good to see them at the table. The other interesting one was you see a lot of individuals named on the list. I forget the exact number, but it seemed like probably a good 10 or 20% of the applicants had some individual person's name on it. And, you can go in and sort of figure some of them have history with spectrum auctions. Some of them are clearly speculating or seeing if they can get a good deal. But that may be an interesting dynamic in all of this, right? Who are some of these individuals out there in the auction? And why didn't they set up a shell company like the other guys?
That's a good point. I know. You see a lot of the names that I noticed on there were ones we've seen on these lists for the past, 10, 15, 20 years. And it does seem like it almost harkened back to, the back in the old, when the FCC was giving away spectrum back in the 50 megahertz days, the A and B licenses, again, it was a lot of just individual people filling out forms and getting licenses. And it almost seemed like, it almost kind of looked back to, people just putting their names down and saying, hey, maybe I can get lucky and get a license there.
Yeah, it is a little bit surprising, and especially given some of the build-out requirements and things, the hurdle has been raised for a lot of these companies and individuals. So we'll see if any of them really come away with any significant purchases in the auction. But that always keeps a little bit of entertainment value to the auction process itself.
Yeah, and it's a good point too. You mentioned about the rural guys. Again, I think we saw C Spire in there. I think Cellcom out of Wisconsin in there. U.S. Cellular's in there as well. So yeah, a lot of companies who, and like you said too. The 700 megahertz auction was supposed to be a big way for these guys to really improve coverage. But the rules for 700 megahertz, the different band plans, kind of seem to have pushed off a lot of their abilities to launch in a good, at a reasonable time frame.
Exactly.
For this auction here, the FCC seemed a lot more proactive, and I think to this point, ensuring that there isn't that same kind of band plan issue that we saw with 700 megahertz. So that should make it easier for these guys to, like you said, get equipment, get devices, have roaming deals if they need those as well. So that's a big part of this too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess, maybe looking again at kind of this whole process. I mean, were there any, you've already mentioned a lot already, but anything that maybe the FCC perhaps left on the table here that might be an issue going down the road? I mean, I know you mentioned the mock auction part that still has to happen for the reverse part of it, but obviously with that as well. But anything that you maybe see that could, that might, that you're hearing at least, that might, provide some sleepless nights for some people who are involved in the process?
Yeah, we talked about the mock auction and the repacking. Those are absolutely big topics. I'll say the other one that we're hearing a lot from folks is just what the pace of this auction is going to be. Past auctions, forward auctions, we've had a pretty good idea of what the rhythm would be, how many rounds per day, things like that. So far, not really any significant information on the topic. Now, a lot of the folks we're talking to that have, pretty good ideas of what's going to happen. The view is that the auction will probably start off, at least on the reverse side, pretty slow. Like we're probably going to look at one round a day when we start off. And a lot of that is that the FCC's rules require them to essentially do a full simulation of the whole country after every round.
Yeah.
So there's a pretty good degree. It's going to take it could take a couple 3 hours or something to run that perhaps, and so that probably makes sense. And quite frankly, as new as the system's going to be, starting out one round a day is probably okay. But the question is, how quickly are they going to step on the gas pedal? The auction itself mathematically can really go. The reverse auction can mathematically go a maximum of 52 rounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you assume a couple rounds a day on average, perhaps, then you're talking about basically a month. But we don't know exactly when it's going to start.
Yeah.
It feels like it's going to be sometime in May, but don't know. And, we don't know exactly how fast it could go. It could be over in 3 weeks. It could be over in 2 months. Who knows what will happen. So we got a little bit of a waiting game, but hopefully some good news to come and new news to come here over the next, probably 2-3 weeks.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. I guess the pace of it is going to be an interesting aspect because, like you said, at least here in the media, and obviously you guys too, when you follow these auctions in the past, yeah, like you said, there has been that rhythm to it. We kind of know what to expect. But you're right. This is not that the FCC is being any more quieter in the process, but there's so much going on. It seems like behind the scenes that I'm not sure they have anything really to report at this point. I mean, there's I keep checking every couple hours on the FCC site to see any news, and not much is really coming out at this point. But again, it's still so much kind of back and forth behind the scenes at this point that it's really not much to report. So
yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, we're at the point right now where no news is good news. There was some worry going back a week or two about a few lawsuits that were out there from some of the low power television stations looking to delay the auction, and for the most part, the FCC was victorious on each one of those. The one exception, there was one station that was added in at the last minute to the auction, based on the court's ruling. But our view is that the addition of one station shouldn't really significantly change their plans. So we expect that train to keep on chugging down the tracks for these next few weeks.
Yeah, and again, the FCC chairman, Sherman Wheeler this has been a big process for him. He has definitely been very vocal in talking about this auction, the importance of this auction, really getting all the parties involved in this auction. So it seems like not that this is his legacy, for instance, but again, this is a big part of what he's done. I mean, between AWS3 and this auction here, and some other special things going on behind the scenes with 3.5 and stuff. It does seem like Spectrum has been a big part of what he's been focused on, and he's got a history in the wireless space too. So he knows the importance of wireless, obviously. But yeah, it does seem like they are very focused on this thing being on time and successful. So we'll see how it all plays out, I guess, going forward now.
Yeah, and I think it's probably in everyone's interest for the auction to be wrapped up before the elections take place. So I would suspect that they are not that interested in having things delayed at all, because as it is, we're unlikely to see the auction results announced before probably end of August, or maybe probably more likely September. So don't want to creep up too quickly to November.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. There's always that auction, the elections hanging out kind of over there as well as an outside influence at some point too. So yeah, you're right. I'm sure they'd like to get it all wrapped up and be done with it prior to November. So, but anyway, hey, again, Dan, definitely appreciate good insight on this. Obviously, this ongoing and nebulous kind of thing keeps moving along, and it's great to get some insight and some clarifications on a lot of things from you on that. So we definitely appreciate the time on that. And for those watching, You can always track down Dan there at PwC to get some insight as well, not to flood his inbox or anything like that, but always great insight from Dan on these things. He's got a lot of knowledge of what's happening. So not to again influence you there, but feel free to check out what Dan's doing there as well. So
anytime.
But again, Dan, definitely appreciate the time on this today. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll talk again soon on the topic. Well, that'll do it for this week's Carrier Wrap. Make sure to check us out again next week when we are scheduled to speak with Rootmetrics to get some insight into its carrier network testing programs.